Why hello and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth and in today's video I will be doing my very first book pairing for my channel. So I'm a big believer that just as certain foods pair together, wine and cheese, certain books complement each other perfectly. Whether they're by the same author or they're about the same topic, sometimes it's just more fun to read books together. So for today's video, I am pairing the hugely, wildly popular bestseller, The Splendid and the Vile, about the London Blitz and Churchill, with a debut novel that came out a few years ago, Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pearce. Both books were absolutely terrific, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to read them together because they did. They just complemented each other so perfectly. One is about the historical significance of the Blitz, and the other is about what it would have been like for an average person. So let's begin with The Splendid and the Vile. This book was absolutely wonderful, and I think it came out at the perfect time in our history here in 2020 when everything is so chaotic and crazy. This book gave me a lot of perspective, and it made me realize that although things are crazy now, they could be a lot worse, and older generations have actually dealt with a lot worse. I mean, what we're going through now is not the same as Germany flying over our cities every night and bombing our cities. So let's just keep things real. You also learn a ton about Winston Churchill, and I adore Winston Churchill. Ever since I've started watching The Crown, I've been fascinated, like many people, with Churchill. And I've always wanted to learn more about him. I recommend, if you did like Splendid and the Vile, to check out the biography about Churchill by Roy Jenkins next. I have read parts of that biography, especially the early years, and it really helped me get into Splendid and the Vile and gain some perspective. So I definitely want to go back to that biography because I remember it was fantastic. And Churchill's life was so broad, so many things happened to him that you're going to want to read a full-length biography about him at some point. I'm really glad, however, that Erik Larson just kept it very succinct. He kept it to this 1 year in Churchill's life, arguably the most important year of Churchill's life, from 1940 to 1941, when he first became Prime Minister and Britain declared war with Germany. This book is amazing. Not only are you getting perspective into Churchill and his inner circle with his family, people in his government, but Erik Larson does a good job about explaining what was happening in America, the American perspective, why Roosevelt was so hesitant to help Churchill at first because it was an election year for him. You also learn about the Nazis, and they were crazy. You learn about some of their leaders. So now that I know about Göring and Hess, I kind of understand why the Nazis lost. They were nutso. And then most importantly, Erik Larson does a really good job of just peppering in diary entries from average people who were living in London during this time. And that just gave the whole book some much needed perspective and some depth because it wasn't so much bogged down by history. Erik Larson's writing style is fantastic as well. He writes in a very narrative voice. He reminds me a lot of David McCullough. David McCullough is better. I do love David McCullough more, but I really want to check out more books by Erik Larson now. I recommend this book if you don't necessarily like history or biography like me, if you more lean towards fiction, because Erik Larson writes this in a very narrative voice. So it's not boring, it's a lot of fun, and for a book that's just talking about so much history, he peppers in a lot of just anecdotes about Churchill's life, and he keeps things light and funny. Even though Churchill was kind of an egomaniac, when and where he needed to, he would be humble. He would just, give an excellent speech, raise people's hope, tell people the truth, but then keep their spirits up. And I think that was his greatest gift as a politician. I really wish in 2020 we had politicians like Churchill, don't you? That would be really nice if we had politicians like that. But that was why I really enjoyed this book, is just learning more about his leadership style. Some characters that I loved from this book, because there's just so much to talk about, so I'll just keep it to the characters I really enjoyed, was probably his daughter, Mary Churchill. She was one of my favorite characters in the book. A lot of people say that Mary was Churchill's favorite child, and when you read this, you completely understand why, because Mary was very similar to Churchill. She had a very similar personality. She was very loving and gregarious, very extroverted. She liked to be around a lot of people, family and friends. And the interesting thing about her was she was only 18 when this events happened. So she was basically just at the start of her young adult life, and she was just having a blast at first, going to parties and debutante balls and going to dances with soldiers. So you get a lot of that. But then she also had this internal conflict of wanting to help out with the war and the war effort, but no one would let her because she's Churchill's daughter. So she kind of rebelled against everyone because she wanted to do something. She wanted to participate in the war effort. And how she participates at the end is absolutely wonderful. I won't spoil it for you, but you're just going to love Mary Churchill. She really tried to understand what was happening in the world, and she was right there. I mean, right at that dinner table with all of them when they were talking. Oh, can you imagine? The next person that I really, really enjoyed learning about was Lord Beaverbrook. Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill put him in charge of aircraft production, and the interesting thing was he was not a part of the military establishment. He was actually a newspaper tycoon, and he was really good about cutting through red tape and getting things done. And so he really taught me the most about Churchill's leadership style. I don't really think at the end of the day Churchill cared about accolades or credentials or who you were. He was really good about having young scientists come and talk to him, and then other world leaders, other thinkers. He just wanted to get a full perspective of what was going on. And he put Beaverbrook in charge of the aircraft production because he wanted the job done. And Beaverbrook did. Beaverbrook doubled aircraft production. And he made me realize that sometimes a lot of sleazy people sometimes have an important part to play in history. So in his personal life, Lord Beaverbrook wasn't exactly the greatest guy, but from a historical perspective, I would say he was probably a hero. And the last person that I learned about in this book was fascinating. I now want to read a biography all about this woman, and that is Pamela Churchill, who was Churchill's daughter-in-law. So Pamela Churchill was also quite young. She was 20, but she was married to Churchill's son, Randolph, and Randolph was not exactly a great guy. And you see this a lot with a lot of very famous people, a lot of world leaders. Sometimes their children are just disappointing. They can't live up to that image that is set by their parents. And that was certainly the case for Randolph. Randolph was a drunk, he was a womanizer, he was a gambler, and he just could not get his act together. And so seeing how Pamela dealt with that and how she navigated and just kind of clawed her way up in society and got to where she needed to be, it was really, really inspiring. And I really loved her a lot. Just to give you a tidbit about her, later on in life, she was the French ambassador to the United States. So you know Pamela knew Bill Clinton for sure. So I adored this book. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, not only do you learn so much history, but you just get a feeling for Churchill and his inner circle. And there are so many funny anecdotes as well. Erik Larson also does a great job of describing what it was like for an average citizen. So he makes use of something called mass observation diaries, which was really great that the British government did this, as they had people in government and then average citizens keep diaries and describe what was going on. And that just must have been a wealth of knowledge for Erik Larson. And it just put all the historical details into perspective. So I love this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And if you're looking for a good pick for Nonfiction November, I highly recommend it. The next book that I wanted to talk about, switching gears, this is kind of like a David and Goliath situation, is Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pearce. This is a fiction book. This is not nearly as good as Splendid and the Vile. It's just a little story, a little historical fiction, but it is about a woman that is living in London during the Blitz, a young girl. And her name is Emmy Lake, and she desperately wants to be a newspaper reporter. So she wants to be like Rory Gilmore, be on the front lines, a war correspondent. And she answers this ad. She thinks it's going to be for a reporting job with a really important newspaper in London. But it turns out it is for a secretary position for a women's magazine. And the women's magazine has fallen on hard times. It's under-circulated. Everyone is just going through the motions. And she works for this very formidable woman named Mrs. Bird. And Mrs. Bird is very no-nonsense. She basically, the only thing she'll do for the magazine is answer the letters to the editor. And then the rest of the time she is off on committees and working with charities and supporting the war. So she tells Emmy, she says, look, I will not answer any letters that are too personal or too romantic. I will only answer letters that have to do with the war and the war effort. And Emmy is conflicted because all of the letters she's reading are basically from all these heartbroken women throughout England who just want a little piece of advice from Mrs. Bird. And so Emmy decides to answer some of these women back who are dealing with some very romantic entanglements, and she gets in a little bit of trouble. So it's a lot of fun. I absolutely adored this one. My favorite thing about it is that in addition to working for the magazine, Emmy also works for the fire department. She is a telephone dispatcher, so sort of like a 911 operator. And those were really my most favorite parts of the books. I absolutely loved those sections because you're reading Splendid in the Vial and you're getting all this historical context of all the decisions that Churchill and his leaders were making, of what was going on with the Nazis. But in Dear Mrs. Bird, you see what it was like for an average person. And after the Germans left and bombed the city every night, obviously people were dying and their homes had been destroyed, and, or worse, they were missing. And so it was often the firefighters and the ambulance drivers that were first on the scene. So reading about that was just, it was really interesting and very poignant. There is also a really important scene that happens in both Dear Mrs. Bird, and it also happens in Splendid in the Vial. So learning about it in Splendid in the Vial and how Churchill's family dealt with this historical event, and then learning about how the event affects Emmy and her friends, is very interesting as well. So I really adored this book. I think it's recommended a lot for people who are fans of the Literary Guernsey and Potato Peel Society. If you like that book, you'll love this one. It's not as good, but it still has that same heartwarming quality. And I really enjoyed it. And well, I'm not quite finished yet. I think that maybe if Dear Mrs. Bird sounds a little too mild for you and you're looking for something a little more full-bodied, I have one more recommendation, and that is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This is a science fiction classic. It's gained a lot of attention recently because of the Amazon Prime television show, and I haven't seen the show, but now that I've read the book, I think I might check it out because the book was absolutely fantastic. If you're unfamiliar with the story, it talks about what the world would have been like if the Nazis had won World War II and the Axis powers had gained control of the entire world. So basically the Nazis control Europe and they control the east coast of the United States, and places like New York have concentration camps now. On the west coast, the Japanese control the west coast, and most of the story takes place in San Francisco. And you're just dealing with a lot of people just like today, trying to navigate through their life, trying to find meaning in their life, but they just happen to live in this alternate version of reality. And it's fascinating because what Philip K. Dick is doing, which a lot of science fiction writers do really well, is he's pointing out some basic truths about our own society from the perspective of these characters in this universe that they're living in. And it's really fascinating because it just makes you realize that, you know, there's always going to be egomaniacs in power. You really can't do much about it, but you got to stay true to yourself. You got to find your own perspective, your own meaning in your life. And one of the things that these characters do a lot is they're always like trying to figure out what the world would have been like if the Allies had won, if it had been our version of reality. And some of the things they say is really hard to take, because one of the characters, for instance, will say, well, if the Allies had won, the whole world would have, communism would have spread throughout the world. And you're just sitting there going, okay, yeah, that's kind of true. And Philip K. Dick, right at the beginning, he tells you what happens to Churchill and he tells you what happens to Roosevelt, and it really made me think, like, is history all based on one person like Churchill? Could things have been completely different if Churchill had never existed or never been around during World War II? And part of me thinks that, yeah, maybe, and part of me thinks like, no, I mean, history just moves right along. People that want to be in power will be in power. So I really enjoyed Man in the High Castle, and I recommend it if you're looking for something a little richer, a little more full-bodied to pair with Splendid in the Vial. So there you have it, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for my very first book pairing. I really enjoyed these books, and I would like to do more book pairings in the future because I have a lot more great ideas. My goal with this is basically to recommend the book I want to recommend to you, but then give you a few extra books to throw in. So I'm recommending Splendid and Laval. That's an excellent book, and I hope that many of you will pick it up in Nonfiction November. Thank you, everyone, and have a terrific day.